The galaxy had 32 spacefaring species, and not a single one of them feared humanity. That was the truth of it, the simple and undeniable reality that every ambassador, every warlord, and every scholar accepted without question when they looked at the small, soft-skinned creatures from the little blue world called Earth. Humans had joined the Galactic Concord nearly 200 years ago, back in the year 2991, and in all that time they had done nothing remarkable enough to earn either fear or admiration from the great powers of the galaxy. They were decent traders who always wanted a fair deal instead of a winning one. They were adequate engineers who built things that worked but never impressed. They were unremarkable soldiers who trained hard but never started fights. And most of all, they were polite. Endlessly, painfully, almost embarrassingly polite. The Terran Systems Alliance, as humanity called its government among the stars, controlled about 40 colonized worlds spread across a modest stretch of the Orion Arm. It was not a small territory by any means, but compared to the empires that truly ruled the galaxy, it was nothing. The Valith Dominion, a proud and ancient empire of reptilian predators who stood 8 feet tall and had scales like black iron, controlled over 300 worlds and commanded the largest military fleet in known space. Their warlord council answered to no one, and their soldiers were born and bred for conquest. Then there was the Okwari Collective, a hive-minded insectoid race that thought as one and moved as one, controlling vast swaths of the galactic core with cold efficiency and an army that numbered in the trillions. Between these two giants and the dozens of smaller species that filled the gaps, humanity was just another face in the crowd. Welcome at the table, but never expected to lead the conversation. And that was exactly how most species preferred it. But there was one species in the galaxy that did not share this comfortable view of humanity. And that species was the oldest of them all, the Droon. No one knew exactly how old the Droon were, but the most conservative estimates placed their civilization at over 4 billion years, older than most of the stars that the younger species called home. They had transcended physical form long ago, and existed now as vast, shimmering intelligences that drifted through the deep void between galaxies, returning to the Concord only when something truly mattered. They were the arbiters, the watchers, the ones who had seen empires rise and fall like waves on an endless ocean. When the Droon spoke, the galaxy listened, because the Droon had never once been wrong. They had predicted the collapse of the Yendari Empire 3,000 years before it happened. They had warned the Okwari about a solar event that would have destroyed their homeworld, saving billions of lives. They had foretold the discovery of hyperspace travel a full century before any species achieved it. Every prophecy, every warning, every quiet word from the Droon had come true without exception. So when humanity first entered the Galactic Concord in 2291, and the Droon called a full assembly of every species for the first time in 10,000 years, the galaxy paid attention. The eldest of the Droon, a consciousness so ancient it remembered the birth of the Milky Way itself, was known as Overmind Sethal. Sethal rarely communicated directly, preferring to observe in silence from the dark spaces between stars. But on that day, Sethal manifested in the Great Assembly Hall on the neutral world of Cathara. The hall fell silent. Every ambassador, every diplomat, every ruler watched as the shimmering form of Sethal filled the chamber with pale light. And then Sethal spoke, not through sound, but through a pause, thought that pressed itself into every mind in the room with the weight of absolute certainty. 9 words. That was all. Do not wake what sleeps behind human eyes. The silence that followed lasted nearly a full minute before it was broken by laughter. Warlord Draxus of the Valith Dominion was the first to laugh, and he laughed the loudest. He slapped one massive clawed hand against the arm of his throne and turned to his generals with a grin full of sharp teeth. "Humans," he said, "the little pink creatures who could not even breathe underwater or survive a fall from their own buildings without breaking. Those were the ones the mighty Droon feared?" The laughter spread through the hall like fire. The Okwari delegates clicked their mandibles in what passed for amusement among their kind. The Pelori scholars exchanged confused glances. Even the smaller species, the ones who had the most reason to take any warning seriously, could not help but smile at the absurdity of it. Only the human delegation sat in silence, and if anyone had been watching them closely, which no one was, they might have noticed something strange in the way Ambassador Chen Wei lowered his eyes, not in shame or confusion, but in something that looked almost like agreement. The prophecy was recorded, archived, and promptly forgotten by everyone except the Droon, who withdrew from galactic affairs shortly after, as if they had said everything that needed to be said and now could only wait. 200 years passed. Humanity continued to be exactly what everyone expected: cooperative, cheerful, and completely unthreatening. And then the Valith Dominion decided it wanted the Korath Corridor. The Korath Corridor was a stretch of hyperspace lanes that cut travel time between the Outer Rim and the galactic core by nearly 60%, and 3 of its key access points sat within Terran space. The Valith had negotiated for access, and for decades, humanity had offered to share it freely with all species, which was exactly the kind of answer that made the Valith furious, because they did not want to share. They wanted to own. Tensions had been building for years, but they came to a head at the Concord Summit on Cathara, where Ambassador Lena Vasquez of the Terran Systems Alliance stood before the Assembly and proposed a joint-use treaty that would give every species equal access to the corridor. It was a fair proposal, generous even, and that was precisely what Warlord Draxus could not stand. He rose from his seat, all 8 feet of black-scaled fury, and pointed one clawed finger at Vasquez. He called humanity weak. He called them cowards who hid behind smiles because they lacked the strength to bare their teeth. He called them the galaxy's pets, kept around for amusement, tolerated out of pity, and useful for nothing except filling seats at assemblies that mattered. The hall went quiet. Vasquez stood perfectly still through all of it, her face calm, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on Draxus with an expression that revealed nothing at all. When he finished, she simply said that the proposal remained on the table and that humanity hoped for a peaceful resolution. Draxus laughed again. He told her there would be no peaceful resolution, and that the Dominion would take what it wanted, as it always had. Vasquez nodded once, turned, and left the chamber without another word. That night, on the Valith homeworld, one of Draxus's oldest advisors, a scarred veteran named Torvon, who had survived more wars than most species had fought, brought an old datapad to the warlord's private chamber. On it was a single entry from the Concord archives, dated 200 years prior. The Droon prophecy. Draxus read it, and a flicker of something passed across his face. Not fear, but perhaps the shadow of a question he did not want to ask. Then he tossed the datapad onto the table and turned away. "Prophets are wrong all the time," he said. Torvon said nothing, but he did not pick up the datapad, and he did not leave the room immediately. Instead, he stood there for a long moment, looking at the words on the screen, feeling something cold settle in the base of his spine, something old and instinctive that his species had not felt in a very long time, something that might have been called dread. "Prepare the invasion fleet," Draxus said, and Torvon, because he was a soldier and soldiers follow orders, bowed his head and obeyed. Somewhere in the dark between galaxies, Overmind Sethal stirred for the first time in a century, and turned its ancient gaze toward a small blue world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. And if a being of pure thought could feel sorrow, then perhaps that was what rippled through the void in that moment. Sorrow not for what was about to happen to humanity, but for what humanity was about to do in return. The attack came without warning on a Tuesday morning, though the word morning meant different things on different worlds. On New Geneva, it was dawn, the pale golden light of the colony's sun just beginning to touch the glass towers of its capital city, where 500,000 people were waking up, making breakfast, walking their children to school, and starting their ordinary lives without any idea that they had less than 20 minutes left. On Elysium, it was late afternoon, and the markets were still busy with traders and families enjoying the warm air. On Korath Prime, it was the middle of the night, and most of the population was asleep. 3 worlds, 3 simultaneous strikes. The Veilith Dominion had sent its finest, a fleet of over 800 warships that had jumped into Terran space through unmonitored hyperspace routes. Splitting into 3 attack groups with the precision of a species that had been conquering worlds since before humanity had learned to use fire. New Geneva was the primary target, and Warlord Draxus had given very specific orders about what was to happen there. He did not want a conquest. He wanted a message. The orbital bombardment began at exactly 0617 local time, and within 4 minutes, the capital city of Aurelia ceased to exist. Plasma beams from Veilith dreadnoughts cut through the atmosphere like burning fingers from the sky, turning steel and glass and stone into nothing but heat and light and silence. The shields, the modest planetary defense grid that humanity had built and maintained with the same quiet competence they applied to everything, held for almost 90 seconds, which was longer than anyone had expected, but nowhere near long enough. When the shields fell, so did Aurelia. Buildings that had taken decades to build were reduced to molten slag in the time it takes to draw a breath. Parks where children had played the day before became craters of black glass. Hospitals, schools, libraries, homes, none of it mattered to the beams that fell from the sky with cold and terrible efficiency. And then the ground troops came. Veilith soldiers descended in drop pods by the thousands, 8-foot reptilian warriors in black armor who moved through the smoking ruins with weapons raised, rounding up survivors and herding them into open spaces where they could be counted and controlled. The soldiers were not gentle. They separated families without hesitation, pulling screaming children from the arms of their parents and shoving the elderly to the ground when they moved too slowly. They executed anyone who resisted, not with any particular cruelty, but with the casual indifference of predators who had never once considered that their prey might matter. And they filmed everything, every moment of the occupation, every act of dominance, every image of human beings on their knees in the ashes of their own city was recorded and broadcast across the galaxy on every open channel the Veilith could access. The message was simple. This is what happens to those who stand in the way of the Dominion, and this is what will happen to anyone else who tries. On Elysium, the story was much the same, though the resistance lasted longer because the colony had a small military garrison that fought with desperate courage until they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. On Korath Prime, the night attack caught most of the population in their beds, and by the time the sun rose, the Veilith flag flew over every government building on the planet. In total, across all 3 worlds, the death toll in the first 24 hours was estimated at over 200,000, and that number would only grow in the days that followed. The galaxy watched, and the galaxy did nothing. An emergency session of the Galactic Concord was called within hours, and every species sent their representatives to the Great Assembly Hall on Cathara to debate and discuss and condemn with the strongest possible language. The Polari delegation called the attack unconscionable. The Rithani expressed deep concern. The Okwari Collective, whose hive mind could have mobilized a fleet large enough to end the conflict in days, formally abstained from the vote. Not because they supported the Veilith, but because intervening would have been inconvenient, and the collective did not do inconvenient things for the sake of others. Resolution after resolution was proposed, amended, watered down, and ultimately passed with language so careful and so empty that it meant absolutely nothing. The Veilith ambassador received each condemnation with a polite nod and changed nothing at all. Humanity was alone, and for 3 days the Terran Systems Alliance was silent. No demands, no threats, no pleas for help, no angry speeches broadcast. Across the stars, just silence, deep and total and strange. On Earth, people gathered in the streets, not to protest or riot, but simply to stand together and watch the footage from New Geneva on massive public screens. And the silence in those crowds was the loudest thing anyone had ever heard. Ambassadors from a dozen species stationed on Earth reported the same observation back to their governments. Something had changed in the humans around them, something fundamental and frightening, though none of them could quite put it into words. The humans had stopped smiling. Not in the way that sad people stop smiling, or angry people stop smiling. It was something else, something deeper, as if a mask that had been worn for 200 years was slowly and deliberately being removed, and what was underneath was something that no alien had ever been allowed to see. On the 4th day, Ambassador Lena Vasquez stood before the Galactic Assembly for what would be her final address. She wore black, and her face was calm, and her voice, when she spoke, was steady and quiet, in a way that made the air in the chamber feel heavier. She did not ask for help. She did not demand justice. She did not raise her voice even once. Instead, she read names. 11,400 names. Every child under the age of 12 who had been confirmed dead on New Geneva. She read each one clearly and carefully, pausing between them just long enough for the sound to settle into the silence. And she did not stop for water, and she did not stop for rest, and she did not stop when several alien delegates quietly left the chamber because they could not bear to listen any longer. It took over 3 hours. When she finally finished, she looked up from her datapad and found Warlord Draxus across the chamber. Their eyes met, and what Draxus saw in that moment, though he would never admit it to anyone, made something cold and unfamiliar stir in his chest. Vasquez said only 5 words. "You were warned about us." Then she turned and walked out of the chamber, and behind her, every human delegate rose and followed without a word. The Terran Systems Alliance formally withdrew from the Galactic Concord that same hour, severing every treaty, every trade agreement, every diplomatic channel, and every line of communication, with a speed and completeness that stunned even the most experienced political observers in the galaxy. Within a day, Terran borders were sealed. Within a week, every human ship outside Terran space had returned home. Within a month, the only thing the galaxy knew about what was happening inside human territory was absolutely nothing. Just silence, stretching from star to star like a held breath. And then the Droon returned, a single vessel, though vessel was a generous word for the continent-sized shape of living light that appeared in the neutral zone, dropped out of whatever dimension the Droon called home, and hung motionless against the stars. Overmind Sethal, who had not spoken to the galaxy in over a century, sent a single transmission. It was not directed at any government, any species, or any leader in particular. It was sent everywhere, to everyone, on every frequency and every channel, in every language the galaxy had ever known. 8 words, delivered with the weight of a being that had watched stars die and civilizations crumble to dust. It is too late. What sleeps now wakes. The transmission ended, and the Droon vessel remained where it was, silent and watching, like a mourner standing at the edge of a grave that had not yet been dug. Across the galaxy, those who remembered the old prophecy, and there were painfully few of them, felt the first real chill of understanding. And deep in the Sol system, buried beneath the gray dust of Earth's moon, in bunkers that had been sealed since the darkest days of humanity's history on their homeworld, ancient doors opened for the first time in centuries. Lights flickered on in corridors that had not seen illumination since the Third World War. Automated forges began to glow with heat that could melt starship hulls. Machines that humanity had built during its most terrible chapters. Machines designed not for exploration or trade or peace, but for the single and absolute purpose of ending anything that threatened human survival. Hummed to life, with a sound like a heartbeat waking from a very long sleep. And somewhere, on Earth, Fleet Admiral Cale Morrow stood in a command center deep beneath the mountains of what had once been called Switzerland, surrounded by screens showing the disposition of every military asset the Terran Systems Alliance possessed, and he read the casualty reports from New Geneva one more time. Then he set the datapad down, looked at his officers, and spoke in a voice that carried no anger, no grief, and no mercy. "Begin full mobilization," he said, "and send word to every shipyard, every factory, and every lab. We are done being kind." The officers moved without hesitation, and across 40 human worlds, the machinery of a species that had spent 2 centuries pretending to be harmless began to reveal what it had been hiding all along. 6 months of silence. That was what the galaxy endured after humanity sealed its borders and vanished behind a wall of quiet that no sensor, no probe, and no spy could penetrate. 6 months during which the Valith Dominion celebrated its easy victory. The Okwari Collective returned to its calculations, and the rest of the galaxy slowly stopped thinking about the soft little species that had been pushed aside like furniture in a room being rearranged by stronger hands. On Kithara, the political analysts agreed that humanity was finished, broken by grief, overwhelmed by loss, and almost certainly preparing some kind of quiet surrender that would let them keep a few of their worlds in exchange for handing over the Korath Corridor. On the Valith homeworld, Warlord Draxus commissioned a statue of himself standing over a kneeling human figure, and he placed it in the grand plaza of his capital city, where every citizen could see it and remember the day the Dominion taught the galaxy that weakness invites conquest. Everyone was so sure they understood what was happening behind that wall of silence. Everyone was wrong. In a quiet research station orbiting a dying star in neutral space, a Polari scholar named Vis was beginning to understand just how wrong they all were, and the understanding was making her physically ill. Vis was a historian, one of the best in the galaxy, respected for her thoroughness and her ability to find patterns in the chaos of civilization, and she had been commissioned by the Polari Academic Council to write a comprehensive study of humanity following the Valith invasion. It was supposed to be a simple project: document the rise and fall of a minor species, analyze their cultural weaknesses, and explain why they had been unable to defend themselves. Instead, Vis had spent 6 months reading, and what she had read had changed everything she thought she knew about the universe. Started with the wars. Humanity's homeworld, Earth, had a history of conflict that was unlike anything Vis had ever encountered in her centuries of studying alien civilizations. Most species fought wars, of course, territorial disputes, resource conflicts, ideological clashes, but human wars were different in a way that Vis struggled to describe even to herself. They were not just violent, they were creative in their violence, endlessly inventive in finding new ways to cause suffering on scales that should have been impossible for a species with such short lifespans and such fragile bodies. She read about something called the Siege of Stalingrad, where humans had fought each other in the frozen ruins of a single city for months, eating rats and leather and sometimes each other, refusing to surrender even when surrender was the only rational choice, dying by the hundreds of thousands in conditions that would have broken any other species in the galaxy within days. She read about Hiroshima, where humans had split the atom itself and used that power not for energy or exploration, but to erase an entire city full of their own kind in a single flash of light. And then, when they saw what they had done, they built an even bigger bomb and used that too. She read about the Rwandan genocide, where humans had killed nearly 1 million of their own neighbors in 100 days, using nothing more advanced than farming tools. And the efficiency of it, the cold, methodical, door-to-door efficiency, made Vis set down her datapad and sit in silence for a very long time. She read about the trenches of the First World War, where millions of young humans had charged into machine-gun fire again and again and again, not because they were mindless, but because something in their nature refused to accept that any obstacle was truly insurmountable, even when that obstacle was death itself. And she read about what came after each of these horrors, because that was the part that frightened her most of all. After every war, after every genocide, after every act of unimaginable cruelty, humans did not descend into permanent barbarism the way most species would have. They rebuilt. They mourned their dead, held their survivors close, wrote laws to prevent it from happening again. And then they went right back to being the kind, cooperative, irritatingly polite species that the galaxy had always known. Not because they had forgotten what they were capable of, but because they remembered it every single day, and chose to be something else instead. That was the truth that the Droon had seen and the galaxy had missed. Humanity was not a species that lacked the capacity for violence. Humanity was a species that had more capacity for violence than any civilization the galaxy had ever produced. More creativity in destruction, more endurance in suffering, more sheer stubborn refusal to stop fighting under any circumstances. And the only thing that had kept the galaxy safe for 200 years was humanity's own conscious, deliberate, daily choice to keep that part of themselves locked away. The Droon had not warned the galaxy because humans were dangerous, the way a predator is dangerous. They had warned the galaxy because humans were dangerous the way a sealed reactor is dangerous. Perfectly safe, as long as no one is foolish enough to break the containment. And the Valith had just broken the containment. This published her preliminary findings in a private report to the Polari Academic Council, and within a week it had been leaked to every intelligence agency in the galaxy. The reaction was immediate and deeply unsettling. The Okwari Collective ran the numbers on human industrial capacity and military potential, and found something that did not make sense. The humans had been operating at less than 15% of their actual capability for the entire time they had been part of the Concord. 15%. Their shipyards could produce vessels 10 times faster than they had been building them. Their weapons research had been deliberately slowed, with entire branches of physics left unexplored, not because humans lacked the ability, but because the results were considered too dangerous to pursue. Their soldiers had been trained to fight defensively, to minimize casualties on both sides, to de-escalate. But the underlying combat doctrine buried in their military archives, the one they had used on each other during their homeworld wars, was something else entirely. The Okwari analysts who read those doctrines requested immediate reassignment to other projects, because they did not want to think about what they had found. Meanwhile, inside Terran space, the silence continued, but it was not the silence of a broken species licking its wounds. It was the silence of transformation. Every factory on every human world had been converted to military production, running 24 hours a day with a workforce that did not complain, did not rest, and did not ask questions, because every single one of them had seen the footage from New Geneva, and every single one of them had made the same quiet decision. The laboratories that had been politely researching clean energy and medical advances for 2 centuries had turned their full attention to the weapons they had always known they could build but had chosen not to. Gravity manipulation devices that could crush a warship like paper, quantum disruption fields that could erase matter at the atomic level. Shield technology so advanced they made the Valith's best defenses look like wet cardboard. And the soldiers, the men and women and others who had joined the Terran military thinking they would spend their careers on peacekeeping missions and border patrols, trained with a cold, focused intensity that frightened even their own commanding officers. There was no rage in their eyes, no burning desire for revenge, just a calm, absolute certainty that what needed to be done would be done, and that when it was over, no one in the galaxy would ever make the mistake of hurting their people again. Fleet Admiral Kale Morrow stood at the center of it all, and he had given the campaign a name that only humans would understand: the Ender Protocol. The doctrine was simple and terrifying in its simplicity. The objective was not to win a war. The objective was not to reclaim lost territory. The objective was not even revenge, though the word hung in the air like smoke. The objective was to make the cost of aggression against humanity so total, so overwhelming, so absolutely and permanently catastrophic, that the very concept of attacking human beings would become unthinkable for every species in the galaxy for the next 10,000 years. Not a victory, a lesson. Not a battle, a monument. Morrow briefed his senior officers in a room deep beneath the lunar surface, and when he finished explaining the plan, no one spoke for a long time. Then his second-in-command, a woman named Commander Yuki Tanaka, asked the only question that mattered: "How far are we willing to go?" Morrow looked at her, and in his eyes was something ancient and familiar, something that every human in that room recognized because it lived in all of them, buried deep but never truly gone. "As far as we need to," he said, "and not one step further, because if we lose ourselves in this, then they have won something worse than any battle." Tanaka nodded, and the room moved with purpose. On occupied Elysium, 6 months to the day after the invasion, Warlord Draxus hosted a victory feast in the governor's mansion he had claimed as his own. The finest Valith generals were there, drinking and laughing, and boasting about their easy conquest of the soft human worlds. Draxus stood to make a toast, and in that exact moment, every light in the city went dark. The laughter stopped. The music stopped. Every screen, every communication device, every piece of Valith technology on the planet went silent. At the same instant, replaced by a single transmission that cut through every channel with perfect clarity. A human voice, calm, female, almost gentle, spoke words that would be remembered for as long as the galaxy existed. "We gave you a chance to be decent. You chose this. Remember that." Draxus recognized the voice. It was Vasquez. He lunged for the window and looked up at the night sky, and what he saw there turned his blood cold in a way he had never experienced in his entire life of war and conquest. The sky was full of ships, not dozens, not hundreds, thousands upon thousands of human warships, filling the darkness from every horizon. Horizon to horizon, each one bristling with weapons that pulsed with energy signatures the Valith sensors had never seen before. Each one moving in perfect formation with the silent, patient precision of predators who had waited exactly long enough. And somewhere far away, watching through senses that spanned the width of galaxies, overmind Sethal observed the moment and felt something that the ancient being had not felt in 4 billion years of existence. Pity, not for the humans, but for everything that now stood in their way. The Battle of Elysium lasted exactly 11 minutes, and in those 11 minutes, the galaxy learned that everything it had believed about humanity was a lie. The Terran fleet did not announce itself with threats or demands, or any of the traditional posturing that military forces use before engagement. It simply arrived. Thousands of warships dropping out of hyperspace in a formation so precise and so coordinated that Valith tactical officers stared at their screens in confusion, because no fleet that size should have been able to move with that kind of unity. The Valith garrison on Elysium was not small. 200 warships in orbit, 50,000 ground troops dug into fortified positions across the planet, and a defense grid that Draxus himself had called impenetrable just hours earlier at his victory feast. The humans penetrated it in 45 seconds. The first thing the Valith noticed was that their shields simply stopped working. Not one at a time, but all at once. Overwhelmed by brute force, the way shields normally failed, but switched off, as if someone had reached into the fundamental physics of the shield generators and told the energy to stop existing. The second thing they noticed was that their weapons would not fire. Targeting systems scrambled, power relays severed by pinpoint strikes so accurate that each beam hit its target within a margin of less than 1 centimeter from distances that should have been impossible. The third thing they noticed, and this was the thing that would haunt Valith soldiers in their nightmares for generations, was that the humans were not trying to kill them. They were dismantling them. Ship by ship, system by system, the Terran fleet took apart the Valith garrison the way a surgeon takes apart a patient. Carefully, methodically, and with absolute control over every single cut. Weapons were disabled. Engines were shut down. Life support was left intact. Was given exactly one chance to surrender before it was reduced to a powerless hulk drifting in space. Those who surrendered were tractored to safety, boarded by Terran Marines who treated the captured crews with a courtesy so strict and so formal that it bordered on ritual, and escorted to holding areas where they were given food, water, medical attention, and the message that they would be returned to Valith space unharmed once the conflict was resolved. Those who did not surrender were neutralized with the same surgical precision. Weapons destroyed, engines killed, communications jammed, but never, not once in the entire battle, did a Terran ship fire on an escape pod, a medical vessel, or any craft that had lowered its weapons. 11 minutes after the battle began, a last Valith warship in orbit around Elysium went dark, and the planet belonged to humanity again. On the ground, the story was the same. Terran Marines dropped from orbit in sleek black, pods that cut through the atmosphere like knives, landing in coordinated waves that isolated every Valith stronghold simultaneously. The ground fighting was brief and overwhelming. The Terran soldiers moved with a speed and efficiency that the Valith had never seen from any species, clearing fortified positions in minutes using weapons that ranged from the impossibly advanced to the brutally simple. But again, and this was the detail that every galactic intelligence agency would analyze for decades, the humans showed restraint that defied explanation. They used stun weapons where they could. They gave warnings before every assault. They carried medical supplies for the enemy wounded alongside their own. And when they found the camps where Valith soldiers had been holding human civilians, the camps where families had been separated, and the elderly had been beaten, and the children had been kept in conditions that no civilized species should ever have tolerated, the Terran Marines did not execute the guards. They arrested them, cataloged the evidence, treated the injured, and moved on with a cold professionalism that was somehow more terrifying than any act of vengeance could have been. Because a species that could do what the humans were doing, that could unleash this level of military power with this degree of precision while maintaining this standard of mercy, was not a species that was out of control. It was a species that was in absolute control, and that control was the most frightening thing the galaxy had ever witnessed. The liberation of Elysium was just the beginning. Within days, the Terran fleet pushed into Valith space itself, and the speed of the advance shattered every strategic model that every military analyst in the galaxy had ever built. Colony after colony fell to the human advance, and on each one, the pattern was the same. Military targets destroyed with ruthless efficiency. civilian infrastructure left untouched. And in the wake of every conquest, a wave of humanitarian aid that included food, medicine, clean water, and construction materials, delivered by the same soldiers who had just defeated the defending garrison. The Veilith civilians on those worlds watched in stunned disbelief as human medics treated their children, and human engineers repaired their power grids, and human soldiers stood guard over their homes to protect them from the chaos of a collapsing government. This was not how conquerors behaved. This was not how any species they had ever known behaved after being attacked and invaded and having their children killed. And that was exactly the point. The galaxy watched the advance with a mixture of awe and naked terror, because what the humans were demonstrating was something that no species had ever achieved on this scale: the ability to wage total war and total mercy at the same time, to be both the most devastating military force in galactic history and the most disciplined humanitarian operation ever mounted, simultaneously and without contradiction. The Polari scholar Vis, watching the footage from her research station, wrote a single sentence in her journal that would later become famous. They are not showing mercy despite their anger. They are showing mercy because of their anger, because they know what they are capable of, and they refuse to become the thing they are fighting. The Okari Collective formally apologized for its abstention at the Concord vote, sending a diplomatic delegation to the Terran fleet with gifts and expressions of deep regret that arrived too late and meant too little, and everyone knew it. Smaller species that had been afraid to speak during the invasion now scrambled to declare their support for humanity, sending token fleets and symbolic gestures that the Terran command accepted with polite nods and quiet eyes. Veilith Dominion crumbled. Not slowly, the way empires usually fall, but rapidly, like a structure that had always been held together by fear, discovering that its foundations were made of nothing at all. The final battle came above the Veilith homeworld itself. Warlord Draxus, who had refused every offer of negotiation and every demand for surrender, with increasingly desperate fury, gathered what remained of the Dominion's brand fleet, 400 warships, the last real military force the Veilith possessed, and positioned them in a defensive formation around his world. Fleet Admiral Kaomaro brought 2,000 ships. The battle was ferocious in its opening minutes, because the Veilith were fighting for their homeworld, and they threw everything they had into the defense with the savage courage of cornered predators. But the outcome was never in doubt. One by one, the Veilith ships were disabled, boarded, or forced to surrender as the Terran fleet closed around them like a fist. And through it all, Moro's flagship, a massive vessel called the Remembrance, named for the dead of New Geneva, sat at the center of the formation like the calm eye of a hurricane. Draxus, seeing his fleet crumble around him, did the only thing his pride would allow. He turned his personal dreadnought, the largest and most heavily armed ship in the Veilith Navy, and charged directly at the Remembrance, in a final act of defiance that was equal parts courage and madness. Moro's ship did not fire. Instead, it caught the dreadnought in a gravity net, a web of manipulated spacetime that wrapped around the Veilith vessel like a hand closing gently around a struggling bird, and held it motionless, while every system on board was remotely shut down with the casual efficiency of someone turning off a light. Terran Marines boarded the dreadnought through 6 breaching points simultaneously, and within 4 minutes they had secured every deck and taken every crew member into custody without a single fatality on either side. Draxus was found on his bridge, standing at the center of a room full of dead screens and silent consoles, his ceremonial sword drawn and his teeth bared in a snarl that had nowhere left to go. The Marines disarmed him without violence, bound his hands, and brought him to the Remembrance, where Fleet Admiral Morrow was waiting in a conference room that had been deliberately stripped of any decoration or display of power. Draxus stood before the human, who had destroyed his empire. And he could not understand what he saw. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not the cruel pleasure of a conqueror standing over his defeated enemy, but something tired and sad and old that looked nothing like victory. "Why?" Draxus demanded, and the word came out raw and broken in a way he had never allowed himself to sound before. "Why did you not just kill me? Why did you not burn my world the way I burned yours? Why did you not do what I would have done?" Morrow looked at him for a long time, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet. "Because killing you would be easy," he said, "and we do not do things because they are easy. That is what makes us different from you." Draxus had no answer for that, and the silence between them was heavier than any weapon the galaxy had ever built. Far from the battlefield, in the cold space of the neutral zone, the Droon vessel still watched. Overmind Sethal observed the end of the war, and the mercy that humanity showed even in its moment of absolute dominance. And the ancient intelligence sent a private transmission to the other Droon elders scattered across the universe. "They are still choosing mercy," Sethal said, "and as long as they keep choosing, there is hope, not just for them, but for everything." And on the ruined bridge of his captured dreadnought, Warlord Draxus sat alone in the dark and thought about a prophecy he had laughed at, and about a species he had called pets, and about the look in Kale Morrow's eyes that was not hatred, but something worse. Something that looked like disappointment in a universe that kept forcing good people to do terrible things. For the first time in his life, Draxus felt small, not because he had been defeated, but because he had been defeated by someone who had every reason to destroy him, and had chosen not to. And he did not understand why, and that lack of understanding was the most complete defeat he had ever known. 1 year after the last Valith warship went dark above the Dominion homeworld, the galaxy was a different place. Not because the stars had changed or the borders had shifted, but because every living being in every corner of known space now understood something that they had not understood before. And that understanding had rewritten the rules of everything. The Valith Dominion no longer existed, not because humanity had destroyed it, but because humanity had done something far more unsettling than destruction. They had taken it apart and helped it become something better. Under Terran oversight, each of the former Dominion worlds had been given the tools and the support to build their own independent governments, with free elections, open courts, and constitutions that protected the rights of every citizen regardless of species or status. War criminals, the generals and commanders who had ordered the bombardment of New Geneva, the officers who had run the civilian camps on Elysium, the soldiers who had committed acts of cruelty that could not be excused by the fog of war, were tried in public tribunals that followed procedures so fair and so transparent that even the Valith defense advocates admitted they could find no fault in the process. Some were imprisoned. Some were sentenced to community service on the worlds they had harmed. None were executed, because humanity had decided long ago that killing prisoners was a line it would not cross, no matter how much those prisoners deserved it. And that decision held even now, even after everything. The refugees, both human and Valith, were resettled with care that bordered on obsession, with every family tracked, and every need met, and every child given a school to attend and a safe place to sleep. And on New Geneva, where it had all begun, the rebuilding was nearly complete. The new capital rose from the ashes of Aurelia like something born from both grief and hope. And hope, not the same city that had been destroyed, because that city was gone forever, but something new that carried the memory of what was lost in every stone and beam and pane of glass. At its center stood a memorial, and the memorial was the thing that made every alien who visited New Geneva go very quiet and stay that way for a long time. It was a wall, simple, white, stretching in a gentle curve, through a garden of earth flowers and alien plants growing side by side, and on that wall were carved the names of every person who had died in the conflict. Every human name from New Geneva, Elysium, and Korath Prime, every Terran soldier who had fallen in the counteroffensive, and every Vaylith civilian who had been killed in the crossfire of their own government's war. All of them, together, without separation or distinction, because the humans who built the memorial believed that death did not care about species, and neither should. Remembrance. The first Vaylith delegation to visit the memorial stood before it in silence for nearly an hour, and when they left, several of them were weeping in the way that Vaylith weep, silently, with their eyes closed and their claws pressed flat against their chests, because they had never imagined that the species they had tried to break would honor their dead alongside its own. The Terran Systems Alliance was now, by any measure, the most powerful single entity in the galaxy. Its fleet was vast. Its technology was generations ahead of anything else in known space, and its industrial capacity was so enormous that it could have built an empire to dwarf anything the Vaylith had ever dreamed of. But it did not build an empire. Instead, it did what humanity had always done after surviving its worst moments. It built institutions. A new galactic accord was drafted, not in the old assembly hall on Cathara, where so many empty words had been spoken. In a new meeting place, built on neutral ground, with input from every species that wanted to participate. The accord was different from the old Concord in one critical way. It had teeth. A mutual defense clause guaranteed that an attack on any member species would be treated as an attack on all, with a joint response fleet that would be assembled and deployed within days, not debated for months while civilians died. An economic cooperation framework ensured that no species could be starved out or bullied into submission through trade manipulation. A rights charter established baseline protections for all sentient beings, regardless of biology or origin, with enforcement mechanisms that could not be vetoed by powerful members. Humanity led the drafting process, but it did not dominate it. Every clause was debated, every objection was heard, and every species had an equal voice at the table, because the humans understood something that most conquerors never learned, that power imposed by force lasts only as long as the force does, but power granted by consent can last forever. The galaxy did not love humanity. That would have been too simple and too easy for a galaxy that was still coming to terms with what it had witnessed. What the galaxy felt was respect, deep, genuine, and tinged with a quiet understanding that sat in the bones of every species like a second heartbeat. Never again. Those two words were never spoken aloud in any official document or any diplomatic speech, but they hung in the air of every room where humans and aliens sat together, and everyone knew what they meant, and everyone understood that the words were not a threat but a fact, as certain and as immovable as gravity. The Polari scholar Viss published her comprehensive study of humanity 6 months after the war ended, and it became the most widely read document in galactic history, translated into every known language and studied in every corner of the galaxy. Every academic institution across the stars, the final chapter was titled The Restraint of Monsters, and in it, Viss argued that humanity's greatest strength had never been its capacity for war. Any species could learn to kill, and many had done so with terrible proficiency. Humanity's greatest strength was its ability to stop, to reach the very edge of the abyss, look down into the darkness, and choose, every single time, against every instinct and every justification, to step back, to put the weapons down and pick up the tools, to bury the dead and plant gardens over the graves, to forgive, not because the enemy deserved forgiveness, but because the act of forgiving was the only thing that kept humanity from becoming the very evil it had fought to destroy. That, Viss wrote, was what the Droon had seen, not a species to be feared, but a species to be awed, because in all the billions of years the Droon had watched the rise and fall of civilizations. They had never encountered another species that fought so hard against its own nature and won. In a quiet prison cell on a neutral world, Warlord Draxus sat across from Ambassador Lena Vasquez and asked the question that had been eating him alive for a year. "Why?" he said, and the word contained everything. Why the mercy? Why the aid? Why the memorial that bore Valeth names? Why the rebuilding of worlds that his people had tried to destroy? Why the refusal to take revenge, when revenge would have been so easy and so justified? Vasquez sat with her hands folded and her eyes steady, and she did not answer immediately because she wanted to answer honestly. "Because our children would have wanted us to be better than you," she said. "And we will always, always try to be what our children believe we are." Draxus looked at her, and for a long time neither of them spoke, and in that silence something shifted between them that was not forgiveness, and not friendship, but something older and more complicated, an acknowledgement that the universe is vast and terrible, and that the only thing standing between civilization and darkness is the choice to be decent, made fresh every single day by beings who know exactly how easy it would be to choose otherwise. On the day the new Galactic Accord was formally ratified, Overmind Sethal appeared before the assembly for what every being in the room somehow knew would be the last time. The ancient consciousness filled the chamber with light that was warmer than it had been before, less like starlight and more like sunlight, the kind that falls through windows on quiet mornings and makes everything it touches feel safe. And for the first time in the memory of any living species, a Droon smiled. It was not a physical expression. The Droon had no faces, no mouths, no bodies in any conventional sense. But every being in the room felt it, a warmth that pressed against their minds like a hand resting gently on a shoulder. Sethal spoke, and the words settled into the silence, like stones dropping into still water. They were the fire that could have consumed the stars. Instead, they chose to be the light. Follow them, not because they are perfect, but because they never stopped trying to be. The light faded. The Droon were gone, not dead, but ascended, moved on to whatever existence lay beyond the edges of the universe they had watched over for so long. Their final gift to the galaxy was not knowledge or technology or power. It was faith, placed not in the strongest species, or the oldest, or the wisest, but in the most stubborn, the most flawed, the most relentlessly hopeful species that had ever crawled out of the mud of a small blue world, and reached for the stars with hands that had once held weapons, and now held something better. 3 years later, on the rebuilt New Geneva, a human teacher named Amara Osei led a class of children through a history lesson in a bright classroom with wide windows that looked out over the memorial garden. The children were a mix of species. Human kids sat next to young Valeth with their small dark scales and curious eyes, beside Okwari juveniles whose antennae twitched with every new fact, beside Pellerai students who took meticulous notes on everything. A young Valeth girl named Kethy raised her hand, and when Amara called on her, she asked her question with the simple directness that only children possess. Why did the humans forgive us? The room went quiet, and every child turned to look at their teacher, waiting. Amara knelt so that she was at eye level with Kethy, and she smiled. Not the polite diplomatic smile that humanity had worn for 2 centuries, but a real one, warm and tired and full of something that had been earned through loss and pain, and the daily decision to keep going anyway. "The universe is not fighting," she said, "it is choosing not to, and that is what makes us strong." Kethy thought about this for a moment, then nodded slowly, and next to her, a human boy reached over and handed her a colored pencil she had dropped, and she took it with a small, toothy smile. And the lesson continued. Outside the window the sky was blue and clear, and the stars beyond it were quiet. And for the first time in a very, very long time, the galaxy was at peace. Not the fragile peace of fear, not the temporary peace of exhaustion, but the real and living peace of beings who had looked into the worst of themselves and chosen together to build something worthy of the best. And somewhere beyond the edge of everything, in a place where time and space meant nothing at all, the Droon watched, and they were not worried. Because they had seen the future, as they always had, and in every version of it, in every possible timeline that branched out from this moment into infinity, there was a classroom. And in that classroom there was always a child asking why. And there was always a teacher, kneeling down, choosing to answer with kindness. And that, the Droon knew, was enough. That was always enough.